Hello.
Story 1. Having dedicated over 15 years to truck driving, I've encountered my share of peculiar occurrences on the vast expanse of the road. These include strange individuals, eerie rest stops, and locations that simply evoke an unsettling feeling. However, nothing has ever truly managed to penetrate my psyche or get under my skin quite like the incident that transpired one night in the autumn of 2019 in West Memphis, Arkansas. I was in the process of transporting a substantial load of produce from Dallas to Nashville and, finding myself running behind schedule, I made the decision to pull over for the night at a truck stop situated just off I-40. This particular location, a roadside oasis conveniently located near an old, rather run-down diner known as the Rusty Spoon, was not unfamiliar to me. While certainly not the worst place to stop, there was always an inherent oddity about it. My loyal companion, Noodles, a scruffy old mutt who has served as my co-pilot for many years, became unusually alert as I guided the truck into the lot, sniffing the air intently. Normally, he would simply curl up and drift off to sleep, but that night he remained alert, his ears sharply perked. In hindsight, I recognize that this should have served as my initial warning. The parking lot was approximately half full, with a few rigs gently idling in the crisp October night air. It was remarkably quiet, unnervingly so for a truck stop. There was no sound of conversation, no rumbling from engines, nor any music emanating from nearby cabs. The only discernible sound was the low hum of the streetlights buzzing directly overhead. As I stepped out of the truck, I was immediately struck by that peculiar prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone's gaze was fixed upon me. I performed a slow, deliberate scan of the entire lot, but observed nothing beyond the neatly arranged rows of trucks and the distant, faint glow of the diner's flickering neon sign. Despite this, the feeling persisted, and I could not shake it. I retrieved my wallet, affectionately patted Noodles, and assured him I would return shortly. His eyes meticulously tracked my movements as I secured the door behind me, and he clearly did not appear pleased with my departure. Upon entering the Rusty Spoon, the overpowering scent of burnt coffee and fried food enveloped me instantly, hitting me like a tangible wall. The establishment was largely deserted, occupied only by a visibly tired waitress positioned behind the counter and an older gentleman situated in a corner, hunched over a plate containing something that looked distinctly unappetizing. I selected a booth positioned by the window and placed an order for a simple meal, eggs, bacon, and toast, nothing extravagant. The waitress offered a terse nod, barely lifting her gaze. The entire diner was eerily silent, save for the faint, low hum of a radio playing a country song from the 1980s. It wasn't until I rose to use the restroom that the situation truly began to take an unsettling turn. I was absent for perhaps only 2 minutes. Upon my return, everything appeared to be exactly as I had left it, with one subtle yet significant exception: my fork had shifted position. It hadn't moved by much, merely a couple of inches to the left. Initially, I dismissed it as my imagination, perhaps thinking the waitress had stopped by, but my plate remained undisturbed, and I had heard no one approach my table. A chilling sensation began to creep up my spine. I cautiously looked around. The older man in the corner remained in his hunched posture, still staring down at his plate, and the waitress was occupied behind the counter, making notes. There was no one else in the vicinity. Attempting to dismiss the unsettling feeling, I resumed my seat and quickly finished my meal. However, throughout the entire time, I found myself compulsively glancing around, the uneasy sensation pressing heavily upon me. I settled my bill and promptly exited the diner. Back at my truck, Noodles was restlessly pacing inside the cab, letting out soft whines. "Relax, buddy," I mumbled, as I unlocked the door. Yet, as I climbed inside, my gaze involuntarily drifted past the lot towards the fringe of trees beyond the gas station. It was then that I spotted him, a figure barely discernible in the faint light, standing precisely at the tree line. He was too distant for me to make out any facial features, and too unnervingly still to be merely someone stretching their legs. He was undeniably watching me. I remained frozen in place, my hand still gripping the door handle. Then, he moved, not towards me, nor away, but an inexplicable, slow, unnatural shift, as if he intended for me to know he had seen me too. The air within the cab suddenly felt suffocatingly heavy. Noodles emitted a low growl from deep within his throat, his fur bristling. I immediately locked the doors. The figure lingered for another few seconds before, without any warning, he simply vanished into the woods, not walking, but truly disappearing. I spent the rest of that night sleepless. The following morning, I was still deeply shaken. I contemplated whether to report the incident to someone, but I couldn't imagine what I would even say. "Hey, some guy stood in the woods last night and stared at me." Instead, I entered the roadside oasis to grab a coffee before commencing my journey. On a sudden impulse, I inquired with the cashier, an older man with deeply etched lines on his face, if he had ever witnessed anything strange in the area. He let out a sigh and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Yeah, now and then," he responded, "mostly solo truckers say they see someone lurking, messing with their trucks. The police never find him." That familiar cold feeling resurfaced. I recounted my experience about the fork and the figure in the woods. His expression remained unchanged. "Did you check your food?" he asked after a brief pause. My stomach instantly dropped. "What do you mean?" I inquired. He sighed once more. "A couple of years back, some guy was drugging food in the diner, slipping substances into drinks and meals. He was never apprehended, but after the authorities became involved, the reports ceased, that is, until a few months ago." I felt a wave of nausea. I hadn't noticed anything unusual about my meal, and I felt physically fine, but the realization that someone had been at my table, had touched my food in my absence, was profoundly disturbing. I thanked him and walked back to my truck, feeling as though my skin was crawling. Noodles was still on edge, his eyes nervously darting towards the woods as I re-entered the cab. I wasted no time. I started the engine and swiftly exited West Memphis. I no longer make stops in West Memphis. Story 2. My name is Eric Donahue, and I have been employed as a delivery driver for the past 8 years, primarily undertaking overnight routes that span across Arizona and Nevada. I have certainly had my share of peculiar encounters, individuals walking directly in the middle of the road, and enigmatic distant lights appearing in the desert that defy logical explanation. However, none of these experiences come close to what transpired on Highway 93. This event occurred approximately a year ago, in late September. I was in the midst of a delivery run from Phoenix heading north to Henderson, Nevada. For those who have not had the experience of driving that particular stretch of road, allow me to paint a vivid picture for you. It is exceptionally long, profoundly dark, and remarkably empty. The vast majority of it consists of desolate desert and open highway, interspersed with only a few small towns that seem utterly abandoned once the sun sets. One could easily drive for miles upon miles without encountering another single vehicle. On that particular night, it was around 1 a.m., and I was cruising along, listening to some late-night talk radio to help myself remain awake and alert. The road was utterly deserted. There were no cars visible ahead of me, nor any headlights reflecting in my mirrors. It was just myself and the highway stretching into the darkness. Then, suddenly, and without warning, a car rapidly approached from behind me. It was a silver sedan, possibly a Honda or a Toyota, and it was traveling at an exceptionally high speed. I distinctly recall thinking that the driver was either under the influence or desperately rushing to reach a destination. It swerved slightly as it drew nearer, then settled into the left lane, preparing to overtake me. It was at that precise moment that I saw her, the woman seated in the passenger seat. Her face was incredibly pale, almost unnaturally so, beneath the subtle glow of the dashboard lights. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed intently upon mine as the car pulled up alongside my truck. Her mouth was slightly ajar, as if she intended to speak something, but was unable to. I briefly glanced at the driver, but I could not discern much beyond a dark silhouette, with hands firmly gripping the steering wheel. Then, in a mere split second, the car accelerated sharply and pulled ahead, rapidly disappearing into the darkness of the night. Now, it is true that strange things do occur on the road. People drive erratically, and passengers sometimes behave in peculiar ways. I attempted to rationalize it, telling myself that she was probably just exhausted, perhaps even playing a prank. However, something about her face lingered vividly in my mind. It wasn't merely fear, but something deeper, as if she was attempting to convey a warning to me. I continued driving, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Approximately 15 minutes passed. I had not encountered another vehicle since the silver sedan, and then, suddenly, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, approaching with remarkable speed. It was the same silver sedan. It blew past me once again, identical to its previous pass, but this time, the woman's face was noticeably different. It was still contorted in a mask of fear, but now her mouth was agape even wider, as if she were silently screaming. And then, just as before, the car rapidly sped off, vanishing into the night. At this point, I was fully awake, my body completely alert. My hands were tightly gripping the steering wheel, and my skin felt a distinct prickling sensation. There was absolutely no way I had merely imagined that encounter. I slightly reduced my speed, carefully scanning the road ahead, half expecting to see the car pulled over or wrecked in a ditch. There was nothing. Another 20 minutes elapsed. The radio was now producing only static. I had turned it off without even realizing it. I continued to check my mirrors repeatedly, anticipating the reappearance of those headlights, but the road remained stubbornly empty. Then, just as I began to convince myself that the ordeal was finally over, the headlights reappeared, the very same damned car. This time, however, it did not speed past me. Instead, it maintained its position behind me, just far enough away that I could barely make out its distinct shape. I realized I could not endure this any longer. I reached for my phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice inquired. I felt truly ridiculous even uttering it, but I proceeded to explain what had occurred, that a silver sedan had passed me twice, each time with the same terrified-looking woman in the passenger seat, and now it was actively following me. The dispatcher remained composed and requested my precise location. I provided it to her. "Sir, there are no reports of any vehicle matching that description on your route," she informed me. This detail, while not necessarily definitive, unsettled me nonetheless. She instructed me to continue driving towards the next town, Kingman, which was not far, and assured me that an officer would be on the lookout. I thanked her, disconnected the call, and immediately checked my mirror. The car was gone. It hadn't pulled off to the side, nor had it slowed down, it had simply vanished. I must have checked my mirrors every 10 seconds for the subsequent hour. Nothing. By the time I reached Kingman, I pulled into a gas station simply to allow myself a moment to breathe. The lot was deserted, except for a lone trucker in the process of fueling up. The air was cool and carried the scent of diesel, normal and safe. I contacted dispatch and informed them I was taking a brief break. Then, driven purely by a surge of paranoia, I inquired with the cashier if he had recently seen a silver sedan pass through. He paused for a moment in thought, then shook his head. "Not in the last couple of hours, man," he replied. I didn't respond, simply nodded, paid for my coffee, and returned to my truck. I completed my route and arrived in Henderson without incident, but throughout the entire drive, I felt uneasy, as if I wasn't alone in the truck, as if someone was constantly watching me. I checked the news the following morning, searching for reports of a missing woman, an accident, anything, but there was nothing. I genuinely don't know what I witnessed that night. Perhaps it was an illusion brought on by sheer exhaustion, or perhaps it was some bizarre, messed up coincidence. But a significant part of me, a very large part, believes that that woman was desperately attempting to convey something to me, and whatever it was, I chose not to linger to discover its nature. Story 3. The most profoundly terrible experience I have ever endured occurred around the year 1996. I was engaged in team driving with another individual. We picked up our load and meticulously scaled it out. I opted to take the initial shift. I drove continuously in heavy rain from Detroit, Michigan, to a point just shy of St. Louis, Missouri. We swapped positions at a rest area and brought our log books up to date. I was utterly exhausted after driving for 10 hours straight throughout the entire night in the relentless rain. One particular detail I will never forget is something the other driver, whom we shall refer to as John, said to me before I began my driving shift that night: "If we get killed, I'll come and haunt you." He delivered the remark with a smile, then zipped up the curtain to retire to sleep. After we had exchanged seats, I zipped up the curtain and put on a movie, My Cousin Vinny, in an attempt to fall asleep. The thought that frequently crossed my mind while in the bunk was what action I would take if our truck were to go over an embankment or a cliff. My best course of action, I concluded, would be to hit the deck, getting as low as possible, and simply pray. While watching the film, I began to drift off to sleep. It was perhaps 45 minutes later when I was abruptly awakened by John's voice exclaiming, "Hang on." I could discern that we were either weaving or that something was fundamentally amiss with the truck's movement. He yelled again, and instinctively, I hit the floor, praying intensely. Were we heading over a cliff? I was unable to see the front of the truck because the curtain remained zipped closed. The next sensation I experienced was the entire truck vibrating intensely for a split second. I could tell that there had been a violent impact. The strange aspect was that there was no loss of forward momentum subsequent to the impact. We were carrying nearly the full gross vehicle weight, GBW, of 80,000 pounds. I will forever remember that distinct sound and feeling for the remainder of my life. Immediately after the impact, it happened with such speed that I barely comprehended what had occurred. We had slid on the wet pavement, become airborne in the median, and ultimately ended up in the lane of oncoming traffic west of St. Louis on I-55/44, just west of a way station. After striking another vehicle head-on, our semi-truck had flipped over and was now facing east. Suddenly, everything became quiet. I was in a state of shock. John inquired if I was all right. I replied, "Yeah, let's just get out of here. I smell smoke." I had been positioned on the passenger side of the floor during the wreck, and now the roof of the cab served as an improvised doorway for me to crawl through on my right. John soon followed closely behind me. There I stood, in my socks, on a wet highway intermingled with diesel fuel. Smoke was emanating from the hood, which was barely recognizable. I wasn't even sufficiently awake to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just transpired. I recall observing people rushing towards the white pickup truck we had hit head-on, carrying fire extinguishers. It felt as if I were trapped within a dream. I simply could not grasp what was unfolding around me. I remember shivering, with blood visibly seeping from my hand and mouth. Once I managed to compose myself, the fire was extinguished. The next thing I recollect was an ambulance attendant conversing with someone on the passenger side of the white truck. I could tell she was comforting the person, and I saw her mouth the words, "I know," with an expression of deep compassion. The next thing I was aware of, John and I were inside an ambulance, being transported to the hospital. I was gazing out of the back doors through the windows as we began to pull away. I started weeping uncontrollably, attempting to vividly imagine the profound fear that the occupants of the white pickup must have experienced upon seeing our semi-truck bearing down directly on them. I have deliberately omitted a few gruesome details that no individual should ever be forced to witness or even hear about. Upon our arrival at the hospital, I received the devastating news that all 3 individuals inside the pickup truck had not survived. A man, his wife, and their 4-year-old daughter. I was overwhelmed by the same profound sense of guilt as the gentleman who had mentioned performing CPR on the driver on the ground in a previous comment. Why did I survive a horrific accident that tragically claimed the lives of 3 people? I will forever recall the distinct smell of that morning, standing amidst diesel fuel intermingled with rain and smoke. As it turned out, that particular stretch of highway was infamously nicknamed Blood Alley due to the deep grooves present in the road, and it had been the site of numerous accidents. Many months later, I drove through that exact spot and observed that they had finally patched that segment of the highway. I sincerely wish it could have been completed sooner. It was immensely painful to revisit and recount this experience after so many years, but it serves as a potent reminder to dedicate 100% of one's focus to driving, especially in today's environment where people are often texting, eating, and reading while operating a vehicle.
Bye.